Well, hi there, students. This is Mr. V, and today we're going to talk about the step-by-steps on how to create a value drawing. Now, some of this information you might find spread throughout several other screencasts, which is okay. In a sense, it's great to hear the same thing more than once. So while you're doing your value drawings, if there's ever any part that you're confused about, either come back and watch this specific screencast or even break out the Frayer and look at the step-by-steps. So, let's take a look and see how to do it. Well, if we look right here in the middle, I'm using the exact same image that you've seen several times over. The purpose of that is so you get familiar with it, and we can take it apart, and it makes it a little easier to understand. So the basic step-by-step on how to create a value drawing breaks down into 3 easy steps. The first, starting at the bottom, is you pre-draw your image out. The second step is you block in your values, or in other words, plan where your values are going to go. You map them out, kind of like a topographical map or a paint by numbers picture, and eventually with practice you do all that in your head as you work. And the final step is to layer in your values. You add several different layers of gray on top of each other in order to get rid of all that line work and to have a great photorealistic image. And finally, while you're doing that layering, or at the end of your drawing, you add the texture to your piece. Textures like fur or rockiness or any other type of texture, a sandy texture. And you just achieve that by using different pencil shading techniques. It's important to note that once again, a value drawing is not a line drawing. It's not a contour line drawing. It's drawn entirely using implied line, meaning you don't actually physically draw any lines. You're actually using shading techniques and whole large chunks of value to make your image. It's as if you're painting on the canvas. Any line work that you do is just there to set you up for the finished product. And the process is very manageable. At first, for beginners, it's important to have a step-by-step understanding on how it goes. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. And eventually, as stated earlier, you'll grow beyond this and just start to do it naturally. Another important consideration is the fact that value drawings take time. It's not something that you can hammer out very quickly. Now, this drawing of a bunny rabbit that I did, it took me about an hour to do. Now, for beginners, this is going to take you guys several days to even get the concept down. That's okay. That's perfectly fine. We're all at different levels, and that varies based on how much we've practiced, not our talent. You start by pre-drawing your form and refining that. You block in your values. Now, you could do this on the side, on a thumbnail sketch if you want. You could do it on the paper, on your actual drawing if you want, as long as it's light. Or you could just do it in your head once you've gotten enough experience. And then finally, you add value by layering it in, light to dark. And you can include the textures as you go, or finally at the end. Now, it's important to remember your percentages. Remember, a highlight is typically, in natural light, 5 to 10% of the piece. Mid-tone takes up the most space, and that's about 60% of the piece, once again in natural light. And finally, the shade is between 15 to 30% in natural light. Now, when I say natural light, I mean you could have images where you've got a lot of light shining on something, and naturally that'll change your percentages. You could be drawing an object that is pure white, and you might have totally different percentages there as well, even though it's in natural light. Totally depends on a couple of things, how much light and the color of your form. But as beginners, just generally think 5 to 10% for highlight, 60% mid-tone, 15 to 30% for shade. Here's an example of the exact same image as those arrows that you see over there in the center, except it's all stacked up on top of each other, and I cut parts of it away to show you what was underneath. So on the far left we've got the finished drawing, on the far right we've got all the pre-drawing. So feel free to pause the video at this point and just kind of look it over and see how that takes form. Study it to get a good understanding of how that process takes place, step by step. Okay, here's a non-example. You've seen this in a previous one. Once again, if you can see not only the contour lines, but also if there's a lot of white in your drawing at this beginner level in class, then there's something wrong. Then either there's not the correct approach to it, or there still needs to be some learning there. Don't worry, that's just part of the growth process. But let's take a look at this piece. It's mostly all contour lines. There's a little bit of value in the hair, but really not much. And if I were to see a human being like this walking down the street who was solid white and actually defined by just contour lines, I'd probably run screaming because it would look like a ghost. So approach this from the perspective as you're painting, in a sense. You're covering whole areas in different values, different grays. It's almost as if you're not using lines at all. and your blocking in of your values is simply there to help you understand where all that paint goes. Now let's look at a couple of different forms and block in our values on them. Except let's look at more and more complex forms as we go, just to kind of give you an idea on how you can do it. So here's a cube, and let's assume that our light source is right smack in the middle of where the cube's at. It's not between us and the cube, but it's not behind the cube. It's right in the middle. So we would have a highlight right in the front. We've got a midtone on the side that's adjacent to it, and finally a midtone on the top because, once again, it's adjacent to the highlight, and the light source is below the top of the cube. If that light source were up or a little bit higher, then we'd have two highlights on it. Our shade or shadow, we can't see it because it's underneath the cube. It's obscured by our sight, but it would sure cast a shadow across the ground if it were resting on the ground. So one of the ways that you can block in your highlights is just simply to label if you want to. Every person can come up with their own technique. It's really not something that's set in stone. Alrighty, what about this sphere right here? This gets a little bit more complicated. It's a little more in-depth than just simply writing your labels on. Here, this would be where you'd actually have to map out where your values begin and end. So looking at this, I'm going to try to find the highlight and the midtone and the shade. The highlight, you could do, this could represent a little circle right here, your highlight, and finally your midtone would be this entire area right here, this whole area, and finally your shade would be this portion right back here. Now let's turn this off really quick and show you a little thing to be mindful of. When you draw, when you do value drawings, you're not just going to have three values that abruptly end like this. You're actually going to smooth them together. You're actually going to blend them together like this. Now advanced students have to be mindful of 5 values. You guys are just mindful of 3. But for good craftsmanship, you need to blend those together to make them look natural. So how do you do that? Well, you don't use a blending stick. You actually blend with your pencil, and I'll show you how to do that. You basically just try as best you can to get the values that are in between all of those. So if you got really solid hard black right back here in the corner, and you've got gray, well naturally you'll try to push a little harder between the gray and the black to get those values in. So strive for craftsmanship, strive for high quality in your work, and shoot for something of this level. Alright, let's take a look at a form a lot of us are familiar with. Now if you look, it's far more challenging than simply just doing a couple of curved lines. What you'll have to, with something like this, you'd actually have to go in there once you've got your pre-drawing done and plan out where your values are. So since this is a black and white picture, how hard you push on your pencil determines what kind of a value you've got. So if you look, we have very few white areas. Most of this is going to be covered in lead, but very light lead. So you'd be using about a pressure 1 on the pressure scale, which represents just a barely little feather touch. That would basically be as dark as your pre-drawing lines, which are very light. Likewise, you'd have a pressure 2, which would be about as if you're, say, writing a sentence. And if you're one of those people who pushes really hard to write a sentence, well, you'll have to scale that back a little bit. But to get this nice light gray, you know, about a pressure 2 on your pencil, and finally a pressure 3 is what you'd use if you're pushing really hard, just short of snapping the tip of your lead. And so that would go for all these black areas. But, once again, look at this baby. It has a lot of in-between values. It's not just one set of gray. You've got a light gray for the top middle part. You've got a normal kind of a gray, medium gray for the handles. You've even got a dark gray in the areas where, you know, the thumbsticks are at. And even between the highlights and the midtones and the shades, there's tons of blending for that nice soft edge. Well, you know, that'd be up to you and your skills in order to get that kind of a blend between them. So let's take a look at it and see exactly where you could block your values in. Well, the red would represent your highlight. You could map out where these little tiny highlights are going to be at, and also notice how few of them there are. The brown would represent the shade, and likewise, look how much more shade there is than highlight. But, where did I map the midtone in? Well, I didn't. I don't need to, because I've already mapped the dark and the light. What I didn't map is going to be the middle one. So, saves you time, and it keeps it from looking all cluttered and crazy, because I don't know about you, I get confused easy when I see too many lines. So that's just a technique on how you could map in your block in your values. Well, that concludes this screencast, and as usual, feel free to rewind it or pause to get a look at things, to get understanding. It's a great part about a digital medium is that you can go over and rewatch it as many times as you need to in order to get the material down. Now that'll help you with the concept, but as far as mastering the technique is lab time and practice. So I look forward to seeing you in class, and have a great day.